My name is Tom Melior. I am 62 years old, and up until the morning of October 14th, 2024, I lived a life defined by the reliable rhythms of structural engineering in Columbus, Ohio. It was a Monday, a gray, damp morning that smelled of wet pavement and exhaust. I remember sitting in my silver sedan at the intersection of Broad and High, staring at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 8:12 a.m. I was thinking about a minor discrepancy in a steel reinforcement report for a bridge project. My chest felt tight, but I dismissed it as the usual stress of a deadline. I didn't know that within 4 minutes, the physical world I had spent 4 decades measuring and reinforcing would simply cease to hold me. The first real sign wasn't a sharp pain, but a sudden, terrifying hollowness. It felt as if someone had pulled a plug at the base of my sternum and my internal pressure was draining out. My vision began to tunnel, the vibrant reds of the brake lights in front of me bleeding into a muddy brown. I tried to reach for my phone on the passenger seat, but my right arm felt like it belonged to someone else. It was heavy, distant, and unresponsive. I managed to put the car in park just as a cold, electric sweat broke across my forehead. There was no cinematic flash. There was only the clinical reality of an acute myocardial infarction. My heart, a muscle I had never given a second thought to, was physically tearing itself apart. The pain finally arrived, a crushing, tectonic weight that felt like a semi-truck was parked directly on my ribcage. I gasped, but there was no oxygen in the air, only the smell of my own old coffee and the hanging air freshener. My head fell back against the headrest. The last thing I saw in the physical world was a pedestrian in a yellow raincoat crossing the street, oblivious to the fact that 10 feet away, a man's life was ending in total silence. I woke up to the sound of snapping plastic. I wasn't in my car anymore. I was looking down at it. From a height of about 15 feet, I watched a police officer use a baton to shatter my driver's side window. The sound was like a gunshot, but I didn't flinch. I felt a strange, detached curiosity. I saw my own body slumped over the steering wheel, my face a shade of blue-gray that I recognized from my father's open casket years prior. I wasn't scared. I was just observant. I watched the paramedics arrive 4 minutes later. They moved with a mechanical, practiced urgency that felt oddly disrespectful given the gravity of what was happening. V-fib. Clear. The lead paramedic, a woman with a tight blonde ponytail and a smudge of dirt on her cheek, pressed the paddles to my chest. I watched my physical body jump, a violent, involuntary spasm that looked like a fish hitting the deck of a boat. The most unsettling part wasn't the gore, it was the conversation. The younger paramedic was complaining about his shift schedule while he bagged me, his hand rhythmically squeezing the blue plastic mask over my dead face. "If we don't get off by 10, I'm missing my kids' game," he muttered. To them, I was a full arrest, a set of protocols, and a ticking clock. To me, I was a man who had left a half-eaten bagel on his kitchen counter and a wife, Sarah, who was currently expecting me to call her when I got to the office. I tried to shout that I was right there, that I was more than a shift change delay, but my voice had no medium to travel through. I was becoming a ghost in a world of hard edges. By the time the ambulance backed into the bay at Grant Medical Center, the detachment was complete. I followed the gurney into Trauma Room 4. The transition was seamless. I moved through the walls as if they were nothing more than thick smoke. The room was a hive of activity. Nurses ripping open sterile packs, the rhythmic thump hiss of the ventilator, and the flat, continuous tone of the EKG. I stood in the corner, near a rolling metal cart filled with intubation tubes. I looked at the clock on the wall. 8:44 a.m. I had been clinically dead for over 20 minutes. I saw Dr. Eris, a man I'd met once at a community fundraiser, leaning over my body. He was sweating. "One more round of AP," he said, his voice tight. "Then we have to call it. He's been down too long." I felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy for him. He was fighting for a vessel that was already empty. I reached out to touch his shoulder, wanting to tell him it was okay to stop, but my hand passed through his scrub top like a breeze. In that moment, the room began to dissolve. Not into light, but into a heavy, profound silence that drowned out the beeping of the machines. The hospital walls didn't disappear, they just stopped matching. I found myself standing in a place that felt like the hallway of the church I grew up in, but it was distorted, like a memory that had been left in the sun too long. The floor was solid, but the air felt thick with a presence that made my skin prickle. I wasn't alone. At the end of the hallway, sitting on a plain wooden bench that looked like it belonged in a bus station, was a man. He wasn't glowing. He wasn't translucent. He wore a simple, dark work shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms scarred by labor. He looked up at me, and the weight of his gaze was more physical than the heart attack had been. It was Jesus, but he didn't look like a painting. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long day of work, and he looked deeply, colonially troubled. He didn't stand up immediately. He sat there with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped, looking at the floor between his boots. The floor wasn't gold or glass. It looked like weathered heart pine, the kind you'd find in an old farmhouse. The air didn't hum with angelic choirs. It was heavy with the smell of ozone and sawdust. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't glowing or otherworldly. They were brown, bloodshot, and carried a weary intensity that made me want to look away. He looked like a man who had been staying up late worrying about a failing business. "David," he said. His voice wasn't a thunderclap. It was a textured baritone, the kind of voice that vibrates in your own chest when someone speaks close to you. He stood up slowly, and I realized he was shorter than me, maybe 5'8". He wore a simple, dark-colored tunic that looked stained at the hem with red clay. There was nothing divine in the Hollywood sense about him, which made his presence 10 times more terrifying. The authority he carried wasn't granted. It was inherent, like gravity. He gestured to the bench. "Sit down. We have to look at something together." I sat. My phantom legs felt the grain of the wood. As soon as I touched the bench, the hallway didn't change, but a section of the wall across from us became transparent, like a high-definition window into my own living room back in Upper Arlington. I saw my wife, Sarah. She was holding her phone, her thumb hovering over my name in her contacts. She looked frustrated, then worried. She looked at the microwave clock, 8:52 a.m. I watched her exhale a sharp, jagged breath and set the phone down on the granite counter. "He's just in a meeting," she whispered to the empty kitchen. Jesus leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "She's praying for a miracle right now, David. But she's praying to a version of me that doesn't exist. And you've been serving a version of me that doesn't require anything of you." The scene in the window shifted. It wasn't my home anymore. It was my church, Grace Covenant. It was a Tuesday night, a week before my heart attack. I saw myself standing in the foyer, holding a clipboard, talking to Mark, our head elder. We were discussing the new capital campaign for the youth wing. I looked happy. I looked blessed. But as I watched, the me on the screen changed. My skin became translucent, and I could see the internal machinery of my own motivations. I saw the pride I felt when the pastor thanked me from the pulpit. I saw the way I looked down at the single mother in the third row who couldn't contribute to the building fund. "You've built a very comfortable fortress, David," Jesus said, his voice dropping to a low, painful level of candor. "You've used my name to decorate a life that is entirely about you." He reached out and touched the window, and the image shattered. Suddenly, I wasn't watching a screen. I was in the memory, but it was cold. I was standing in my office at the engineering firm. My assistant, a young kid named Leo, was crying. He had just told me his mother was being evicted, and he asked for an advance on his bonus. I saw myself, the professional version, checking my watch and telling him it wasn't company policy. In the vision, Jesus was standing right next to Leo. He was looking at me through the back of Leo's head. The me in the office couldn't see him, but the me on the bench felt the sting of it like a physical slap. "You told him you'd pray for him," Jesus said, turning back to me on the bench. "But you didn't even remember his mother's name by the time you reached the elevator. You used prayer as a polite way to say no. You think the uncomfortable truth is about the end of the world, David? It's much worse than that. It's about the end of the mask you've been wearing in my name." The atmosphere shifted from heavy to suffocating. The hallway began to narrow, the walls pressing inward. Jesus stood up and began to walk, and I followed him because there was no other direction to go. We passed doors that were slightly ajar, and through them, I heard the sounds of my own life. The clinking of silverware, the hum of my car engine, the muffled arguments I'd had with Sarah about money. But then, we reached a door that was painted a flat, industrial gray. Jesus stopped. He didn't open it. He just put his hand on the handle. "I am going to show you what happens if you go back and change nothing," he said. "This isn't a threat. It's a structural forecast. You're an engineer, David. You know what happens when the load exceeds the capacity of the foundation." He opened the door. I expected fire or darkness, but I saw something much more mundane and haunting. I saw my own bank app on a smartphone screen. The balance was dropping in real time. I saw a legal document on a desk with my name on it. A lawsuit from the city regarding the very bridge project I had been worried about that morning. I saw Sarah sitting in a lawyer's office, her eyes red, her wedding ring sitting on the table between them. "This is the collapse," Jesus said. "The church you lead, the business you've built, it's all built on a lie of self-sufficiency. In 14 months, the facade breaks. You will lose the house. You will lose the reputation. And you will lose the woman you claim to love." I felt a cold terror wash over me. I wanted to argue, to say I was a good man, a deacon, a tither. But as I looked at him, I saw the scars on his hands. Not the clean, symbolic holes from a painting, but jagged, ugly, thickened tissue where iron had torn through muscle and bone. His sacrifice was visceral. My faith was an accessory. "The warning isn't about a coming storm," he whispered. "The warning is that the storm is already inside the house, and you're the one who let it in." The vision of the lawyer's office didn't fade, it intensified. I could smell the stale coffee and the lemon-scented furniture polish. I saw Sarah's hands trembling as she signed a document I didn't recognize. Jesus stepped into the center of the room, his presence making the fluorescent lights flicker and hum. He looked at me, then back at the version of Sarah who couldn't see him. "You want to know why the title of your life is The Uncomfortable Truth?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked over to the desk and tapped a stack of papers. "The truth is that you've made a deal with a god of your own making," he said, his voice dropping into a register that felt like a physical vibration in my jaw. "You think that because you are a Christian, you are exempt from the consequences of your own character. But look at this." He gestured, and the scene shifted to a Sunday morning at Grace Covenant. The sanctuary was full. I was on stage, leading the opening prayer. My voice was steady, resonant, and practiced. I was praying for the lost, for the broken, and for the nation. It sounded beautiful, but Jesus walked right up to the pulpit and stood behind the me on stage. He looked directly into my eyes, the me standing in the afterlife. "You are praying for a world you refuse to touch. You are asking me to fix things you are actively breaking with your silence and your greed. You want to know what changes in 2026? It's not the government, David. It's the exposure. The uncomfortable truth is that the church is about to be stripped of its ornaments. The reason this happens is because you've used my name as a shield to protect your own comfort. And I am taking the shield away." He wasn't angry. He was resolute. It was the tone of a father telling a child that the consequences of a lie have finally arrived at the front door. I felt a wave of nausea. "What do you mean, taking the shield away?" I managed to whisper. My throat felt dry, like it was filled with sand. Jesus turned away from the pulpit, and the scene dissolved back into the gray hallway. He began to walk again, his boots thumping rhythmically on the heart pine floor. "People ask why the world is falling apart," he said without looking back. "They look for demons in the shadows, but they won't look at the rot in the floorboards of their own homes. The outcome of the next few years is determined by one thing: the death of the performative." He stopped at a window that overlooked a vast, dark landscape. It wasn't hell, it was a city, maybe Columbus, maybe anywhere. I saw lights flickering out in houses, one by one. "The warning I'm giving you, David, is that the era of cheap grace is over." Who is affected? Everyone who has built a life on a foundation of appearance. What determines the outcome? The willingness to be seen in the light without the mask. In the coming months, those who have used the church for social standing or financial security will find the doors locked from the inside. Not by me, but by the weight of their own choices. He turned to face me fully now. "You think you're here because of a heart attack. You're here because your heart was already dead long before it stopped beating in that car. You've been managing a brand, not following a savior. The uncomfortable truth is that I am not interested in your reputation. I am interested in your soul. And right now, your soul is a hollow shell." I looked down at my hands. They were starting to turn gray again, the same color I saw in the ambulance. The detachment was returning, but this time it felt like I was being pulled toward a vacuum. "If you go back," he said, "you don't go back to your old life. That life is already gone. You go back to the wreckage." The hallway began to vibrate. The sound was like a low-frequency hum that set my teeth on edge. At the far end, I could see the trauma room again. The bright white lights, the frantic movement of Dr. Eris. the blue flash of the defibrillator. It looked like a silent movie playing at the wrong speed. Jesus stood between me and the room. He didn't move. He just watched me. "You have a choice, David," he said. "You can stay here. It will be peaceful. You won't have to face the fallout of what you've built. You won't have to look Sarah in the eye and tell her who you really are." He paused, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like grief in his eyes. "Or you can go back and walk through the fire. You will lose the position at the firm. You will lose the respect of the elders at Grace Covenant. You will be an uncomfortable truth to everyone who knew the old David Miller. They will hate you for it, because your honesty will force them to look at their own lies." I looked at the trauma room. I saw my body leap again as another shock was delivered. I saw the doctor look at the clock. They were seconds away from calling it. "Why me?" I asked. My voice sounded small, like a child's. Jesus stepped closer and put a hand on my shoulder. His hand was heavy and warm, the only thing in that hallway that felt truly solid. "Because you know how to build bridges, David," he said with a faint, sad smile. "And the only way to save what's coming is to build a bridge out of the truth. But remember, a bridge is the only thing that gets walked on by everyone. Are you willing to be walked on?" The hum grew into a roar. The hallway began to disintegrate into shards of gray and white. I looked at him one last time, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me, toward the world I was about to re-enter. "It begins with the letter," he whispered. "Don't hide the letter." The transition back wasn't a peaceful drift. It was a physical assault. It felt like being slammed into a brick wall at 60 miles per hour. The first thing I sensed wasn't light, but the taste of copper and the searing, chemical burn of intubation fluid in my throat. My chest didn't just hurt. It felt like it had been crushed and then set on fire. I heard a jagged, mechanical shriek, and it took me several seconds to realize it was the ventilator forcing air into lungs that didn't want to expand. I tried to scream, but the plastic tube in my windpipe turned the sound into a wet, pathetic gurgle. "He's back. I've got a rhythm." The voice was distant, echoing as if from the bottom of a well. I opened my eyes to a blurred kaleidoscope of fluorescent white and pale blue. Dr. Aris was leaning over me, his face slick with sweat, his mask hanging off one ear. He looked terrified. Usually, doctors look relieved when they save someone, but he looked like he'd just seen a ghost walk through a solid door. I tried to lift my hand to reach for the tube, but my arms were strapped down. The clinical reality of the ICU crashed over me. The cold air, the smell of iodine, the rhythmic clack hiss of the machine, keeping me tethered to a world I had already left. I lay there for hours, or maybe days. Time had lost its linear grip on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see darkness. I saw the weathered heart-pine floor and the man in the dark work shirt. I saw the uncomfortable truth he had laid out like a blueprint. As the sedation wore off, the weight of the warning began to settle in my marrow. I wasn't just recovering from a heart attack. I was a marked man. I remembered the last thing he told me: "Don't hide the letter." I didn't know what it meant yet, but the dread in my stomach was more painful than the surgical staples in my chest. I was alive, but the David Miller who cared about his reputation had died on the floor of that silver sedan. 6 days later, I was moved to a step-down unit. Sarah sat by my bed, her face a map of exhaustion and relief. She was holding my hand, her thumb tracing my knuckles, but I couldn't look her in the eye. Every time she spoke about God's miracle and how blessed we were, I felt a physical pang of nausea. She was talking to the mask. I thought about the vision of her in the lawyer's office, the wedding ring on the table. The silence between us felt like a growing chasm. I wanted to tell her everything: the hallway, the warning, the rod in our foundation, but the words felt like jagged glass in my throat. The collapse Jesus warned me about began with a vibration in my pocket. It was my work phone. I hadn't checked it since the accident. When Sarah went to the cafeteria, I reached for it with a trembling hand. There were 42 missed calls and over 100 emails. Most were well wishes, but one was from Leo, my assistant. The subject line simply read, "I'm sorry." I opened it. It wasn't a resignation. It was a forwarded thread from the city's structural audit department. They were flagging the bridge project. They had found the discrepancy I had been worried about at the stoplight, and they were suggesting it wasn't a calculation error, but a deliberate bypass to save costs for the firm. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, warning thud. I realized then that the uncomfortable truth was not just a spiritual concept. It was manifesting in the physical world. I had authorized those signatures. I had looked the other way to hit a bonus tier that paid for our kitchen renovation. Then I saw the letter. It was a physical envelope sitting on my bedside table among the flower arrangements. It was from our church, Grace Covenant. I opened it, expecting a card signed by the congregation. Instead, it was a formal notice from the Board of Elders. Because of the legal complexities surfacing around my firm, they were temporarily suspending my position as a deacon to protect the church's image. The shield was already being moved. The discharge from the hospital was quiet. There were no welcome home banners. The air in our house felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the secrets I was carrying. I sat in my home office, the room where I had spent years calculating loads and stresses, and realized I had no idea how to support the weight of my own life. I looked at the letter from the elders again. It wasn't just a letter, it was the first domino. Jesus had said the era of the performative was over. I wasn't being punished, I was being exposed. I was the bridge that was built with a flaw in the center. The proof happened 3 nights ago. I was sitting in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the ceiling. Sarah came in, her face pale in the glow of her phone. "David," she said, her voice flat and hollow. "The news, they're at the bridge site. They're saying there's a structural failure in the south pylon. They're evacuating the lower road." I didn't move. I didn't feel the need to check the TV. I knew exactly which pylon it was. I knew the date I had signed off on the substandard steel reinforcement. It was June 12th, the same day I had received an award for Christian integrity in business. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I realized that the uncomfortable truth wasn't a warning to save my career. It was a call to let it burn so that something real could be built in the ashes. The bridge didn't collapse, but it was permanently closed, an orange cone monument to my own compromise. Tonight, the house is silent. Sarah is sleeping in the guest room. The lawsuit was served this afternoon. I walked out to the kitchen and saw a single, dead petal had fallen from the lilies on the counter, landing on my Bible. I sat down at the table, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote the first line of my confession. The wood of the table felt cold under my wrists.